He's my father. You're just the man babysitting him until he dies. He asked me to stay, I said. And when he's gone, you leave. That was never your family to keep. She was already looking past me toward the driveway. The car's waiting, Rochelle, Tristan called from it. We have a flight. She picked up her bag. That's all you were ever good for anyway. The woman who had just reduced 16 years of marriage to a single sentence had no idea she was already too late. Rochelle walked out that door, certain that when her father was gone, she would inherit everything and sell it before the week was out. She had calculated the value of every clinic, every building, every acre of the property. She had never once calculated the man she was leaving behind in the house with him. What kind of evidence does a dying man leave when he already knows exactly what his daughter intends to do with his life's work? If stories about loyalty, sacrifice, and the people who quietly hold everything together resonate with you, subscribe, because there is a great deal more coming. There is a particular silence that settles over a house when someone inside it is dying. It isn't emptiness. It's weight. Every room holds it differently. The kitchen holds it in the smell of food going uneaten. The hallway holds it in the light left on past midnight because someone forgot to turn it off or couldn't quite bring themselves to. Over the months I spent caring for Walter Bennett, I learned the texture of that silence, and I came to understand it wasn't something to be fixed or filled. It was only the sound of time moving slowly toward something inevitable, and the one honest thing a person could do was stay present inside it. I had been married to Rochelle for 16 years. Long enough to build something real, or at least something that looked real from the outside, a shared life in Atlanta, a marriage that had survived the lean years when I worked overnight shifts in the emergency department and she took classes 3 nights a week on a schedule that left us passing in doorways more than sitting across from each other at any table. I didn't resent those years. Building something takes time and sacrifice gets distributed unevenly, and the person who carries more for a while is not owed a ledger to be settled later. You do it because the thing you're building matters, because the person matters. What I couldn't have told you then, and only understood slowly watching Rochelle become the woman she had always wanted to be, was that the version of her I married and the version she was becoming were not the same person. The change didn't arrive all at once. It came in increments I kept explaining away. I remembered a woman who brought food to my hospital break room on bad shifts, who sat with her father on Sunday afternoons and sang old songs she claimed not to know the words to. That woman had been real. I was certain of it. What happened to her was more complicated than I had words for. It came with every new title, every year. Tristan spent telling her she deserved something larger. Every morning she looked at the life we'd built and decided it wasn't enough. I didn't hate who she became. I only carried the quiet ache of remembering who she had been. Walter Bennett had not trusted me easily, and that was fair. He had built Bennett Community Care over 3 decades with his wife Margaret Holloway before they married, and he protected it with the vigilance of a man who understood that the things you love most are always most vulnerable to the people closest to them. When Rochelle first brought me home, Walter looked at me the way a man looks at something he isn't sure is load-bearing yet. Studying the joints, waiting for the first sign of weakness under pressure. I didn't take it personally. I let time do the work that argument couldn't. The trust came quietly the way it usually does, not through a gesture or a declaration, but through a sequence of ordinary moments that added up to evidence. The time I drove 2 hours through a rainstorm to fix a broken HVAC unit at one of his clinics because the maintenance crew couldn't reach anyone else. The evenings I sat with him while Rochelle traveled, listening to him talk about Margaret, about the early years, about patients who came back to volunteer after their own recoveries. Walter began to tell me things he hadn't told anyone else, not because I was special, but because I was consistent, and consistency was the quality he respected most. One of those evenings, he said Margaret's maiden name aloud, Holloway, and the way he said it told me it was a name he kept close, a name that belonged to the part of his life he was proudest of. Rochelle's success was real, and I was proud of it. She had earned her MBA through genuine effort and carried Bennett Community Care from a neighborhood institution into something with regional reach and professional management. But somewhere in that transformation, the clinic stopped being her father's life's work and started being an asset she was responsible for maximizing. I watched it happen and said nothing, partly because I didn't know how, and partly because I kept telling myself I was wrong about what I was seeing. I was not wrong. Tristan Cole had been in Rochelle's orbit for nearly 2 years before I understood what he was to her. He founded a real estate investment fund, and he was polished the way men are polished when they've spent years presenting themselves to rooms full of money. He had identified Bennett Community Care's property footprint as significant enough to be worth pursuing through whatever channel was most efficient. That channel, it turned out, was my wife. When Walter's diagnosis came pancreatic cancer late stage, the kind of news that arrives with a timeline already attached. Rochelle managed it the way she managed everything efficiently from a distance, on the assumption that other people would handle the parts requiring physical presence. She said she'd reduce her travel schedule. She said it the way people say things they have already decided not to do. I closed the workshop without discussing it with her first. I had built that place over 12 years, equipment sourced piece by piece. Relationships with hospital procurement offices earned through reliability and fair pricing, a small crew who knew the work well enough that I trusted them completely. Pausing, it was not a small thing. But Walter had reached the point where he needed someone in the house, not just someone stopping by, and Rochelle was not going to be that person. So I did it because it needed doing, and I was there to do it. The day Rochelle told me she was going to the Maldives was not the day I understood what had been happening. That understanding had been building for months, but it was the day I stopped being able to explain it away. Your father has 8, maybe 10 weeks, I said. His own palliative team told us that. Stay through his birthday at least. It's 11 days away. He has nurses. He has you. He has everything he needs. She was folding a dress into a case as she said it. I can't put my life on hold indefinitely. That word indefinitely was doing exactly the work it was meant to do, turning 11 days into an unreasonable demand. What she didn't tell me before she left was that she had withdrawn $850,000 from the clinic maintenance reserve. I found out from the fund administrator, who called asking about a shortfall that was already affecting 2 clinics' ability to restock medications and meet payroll. When I finally reached Rochelle, she was brief and unapologetic. The money was an investment, she said. She'd sort it out when she got back. Then she told me about Tristan. Not as a confession, as information. She said the marriage wasn't working and hadn't been for a long time, and that she intended to file for divorce. The papers came the next morning, along with a note I could stay at the house to care for her father, and after Walter passed, I should make arrangements to move out. Walter heard the last of that phone call through the open door of his room. He didn't say anything to me directly. He told me instead the following evening that he needed to meet with his attorney, that it was something he should have handled earlier, and that he wanted me present when it happened. You don't need to do anything on my account, I told him. It isn't on your account, he said. It's on account of my patients, my staff, and a promise I made to Margaret the year we opened the first clinic that anyone who came to us without money or insurance would never be turned away as long as the doors stayed open. The attorney came 3 days later along with Walter's primary care physician and 2 independent witnesses. Walter answered every question they put to him about his estate, his intentions, and the legal actions he was authorizing. He was precise, oriented, and consistent. He took 2 actions that afternoon. The first was a transfer of 51% of Bennett Community Care's voting shares into the Bennett Legacy Trust, a permanent community trust registered under state law in a form that could not be dissolved, altered, or challenged through ordinary probate. Because it was completed as a legal act between living parties rather than as an inheritance, it existed independently of anything that might later happen to his will. The second was an amendment to his estate documents, naming me administrator of that trust with a fixed salary and a clear mandate: maintain the clinic's community mission, prevent any sale or conversion that would reduce patient access, and report each year to an independent oversight board. Before the attorney left, Walter asked the physician to record a video statement. He answered questions on camera for 22 minutes, demonstrating recall reasoning and deliberate intent. Then he looked directly into the lens and said he wanted to leave a message for his daughter that if she chose to challenge what he had done, this recording would be the first thing the court would see. He instructed the attorney to seal it and to release it only if the will was contested, only before a judge, and only through independent legal counsel, never through any family member. He said he hoped it would never need to be opened. After everyone left, Walter and I sat in the small room at the back of the house. The hardest thing about watching someone you love make a choice that damages them, he said, is that you can't undo it for them. You can only decide what you're willing to hold in the wreckage. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. Walter had two requests in the weeks that followed. The first was that I not contact Rochelle on his behalf, no calls asking her to come home, no messages dressed up as appeals to her conscience. If she comes back, he said, I want it to be because she decided to, not because she was managed into it. The second was that we keep visiting the clinics while he had the energy. He wanted to see them while he still could, and he wanted to see them with someone who understood what they were for. We went twice in the final 3 weeks. The first visit was to the Southwest Atlanta location, the original clinic, the one he and Margaret had opened in the 90s, in a converted storefront with second-hand exam tables and a waiting room that held 12 people if they were willing to sit close. The staff there had known him for decades. They called him by his first name, which he had always insisted on, and they greeted him without performing sadness. He sat in the break room for nearly an hour talking with the nurses about caseloads and about a woman in her 80s who had been coming in monthly for 3 years and had recently started bringing vegetables from her garden as payment because she had no other way to say thank you. Walter didn't say much on the drive back. He watched the city go by, and eventually he said, "That woman with the vegetables is the reason I could never sell. Not the mission statement, not the legacy, just her and the 1,000 people like her who have nowhere else to go." I sent Rochelle a message every evening as I had since she left. I kept them factual, how Walter had slept, what he'd eaten, whether his pain was managed. She read them, the receipts confirmed it, but she didn't answer. I told myself it was the behavior of someone who had made a decision and was afraid that any acknowledgement would complicate it. 12 days before he died on a Thursday afternoon, Walter recorded an audio message for her. I wasn't in the room. Afterward, he handed me his phone and asked me to make sure the file was sent. I forwarded it without listening. Whatever he wanted to say to his daughter was between them. I learned later from Rochelle's own account at the will reading that she had listened to it on the evening of a dinner event she attended with Tristan. She listened for 40 minutes. She did not call. She did not book a flight. In that recording, Walter told her the door was still open if she chose to walk through it as his daughter rather than as his heir. She chose not to. He died on a Sunday morning before 6 when the light was just starting to come through the east-facing windows of his room. I was holding his hand. The hospice nurse was there. His last words spoken the evening before, while he was still intermittently coherent, were for me. He said, "Thank you for not letting me die alone." I called Rochelle 20 minutes later. Her first question before she offered any acknowledgement of what I had just told her was whether her father had signed any additional documents before he passed. "He handled his affairs," I said. "Everything will be explained at the reading." She arrived 2 days later with Tristan and 2 attorneys. The funeral was attended by people I had never met. Former patients' clinic staff going back 15 years, community board members, a retired judge who had served with Walter on a healthcare access committee. The speeches were given by people who knew him through his work. Rochelle sat in the front row and received condolences with the composure of someone performing grief rather than feeling it. The will reading was the following afternoon. The attorney explained the 2 legal actions Walter had taken before his death. The trust transfer completed between living parties and therefore outside the jurisdiction of the estate, and the will amendment naming me administrator. Rochelle received the remainder of Walter's personal estate, the family home, personal accounts, and 24% of non-voting company shares. The rest was distributed among long-term employees and the patient welfare fund Walter had established in Margaret's name. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone except me. "You manipulated my father," Rochelle said. She said it looking at me, not the attorney. "You exploited his illness to make yourself his confidant, and you used that access to extract an arrangement that hands you control of a $90 million enterprise in exchange for a few months of caregiving." I didn't respond. There was nothing useful to say in that room that wasn't already in the documents. Tristan's strategy became clear within the week. Rather than challenge the trust transfer head-on, he went after the will. If the amendment could be attacked on grounds of undue influence, the court might appoint a neutral administrator during proceedings, opening a window to pressure the board into approving a sale. He had Rochelle file a formal contest within 72 hours. The court granted a temporary freeze on trust transactions and suspended my administrative authority. Within days, Tristan approached the Bennett Community Care Board with a preliminary sale agreement framing it as a financial rescue given the operational uncertainty. 2 clinics were already struggling with the supply shortfall. Rochelle's withdrawal had created and the frozen accounts made it impossible to close the gap through normal channels. The hospice center had 9 days of palliative medication left. That was the night I stopped waiting to be rescued by the paperwork. I called my workshop manager and told him I was selling. The buyer had been interested for 2 years. I signed the papers the next morning and had the funds transferred by the end of the week straight into the clinic's operating accounts, enough to restock the pharmacies and cover payroll through the litigation. I didn't announce it. The clinic staff only found out when the new owner came to collect the keys to a workshop that no longer had my name on it. What I didn't anticipate was the effect it had on the people who'd worked for Walter. When word spread that I had sold my own business to cover their wages, something shifted in the way they talked about the situation. I began receiving quiet messages from clinic staff offering to give statements about what Walter had been like in his final weeks, about what they had seen with their own eyes. My attorney had located records confirming Walter's cognitive state at the time of the transfer and the amendment. But the physician who had served as a primary witness had suddenly withdrawn his corroborating statement, and the timing of that withdrawal lined up precisely with the date Tristan's fund acquired a majority position in the debt of the hospital where that physician held his clinical role. Tristan's offer arrived through intermediaries $5 million if I surrendered the administrative role and confirmed Walter had not been fully competent when he signed. The alternative, he made sure I understood, was litigation long enough to outlast my ability to fund a defense. Rochelle came to see me separately without the attorneys. She looked tired in a way she usually managed to hide. She said she was willing to end the legal challenge on the condition that I came back signed off on a structured sale and accepted a marriage that existed in name only. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I want the truth. Did you ever love me? Or did you love the version of me that made your life easier, the one who stayed quietly in the background while you became who you wanted to be?" She didn't answer that. She answered a different question instead. "Your idealism is going to cost a lot of people who can't afford it." "No," I said. "I'll see you at the hearing." That night, my attorney called to confirm that the sealed video was now eligible for submission. Walter's conditions that it be opened only in the event of a legal contest, only before a judge, only through independent counsel had all been met. The recording had sat untouched since the day it was made. No one had accessed it, not even me. The hearing room was not dramatic in the way courtrooms are on television. It was a mid-sized conference room on the 4th floor of a downtown Atlanta legal center, fluorescent light, a long table, water pitchers nobody touched. Rochelle's legal team took one side. My attorney and I sat across from them. The judge assigned to the estate matter was present as an observer for the evidentiary portion. Rochelle's lead attorney restated the core argument that Walter Bennett, in the weeks before his death, had been subject to undue influence by a live-in caregiver who had isolated him from his family and leveraged his emotional dependence to move control of a $90 million enterprise outside the normal channel of inheritance. He was measured and specific. He didn't say I was a bad person. He said I had occupied a position of structural power over a vulnerable man, and that the law existed precisely to scrutinize arrangements made under those conditions. My attorney answered briefly. He said the evidentiary record would speak for itself, and he requested permission to enter the sealed video as the primary exhibit. It played on a screen at the end of the table. Walter appeared as I remembered him from that afternoon, seated upright, dressed in the clothes he wore when he wanted to be taken seriously. Hands folded in the precise way he held them when he was preparing to say something he'd thought through carefully. The physician sat to his left. The attorney and 2 witnesses were visible at the edge of the frame. The date and timestamp confirmed it had been made 6 weeks before his death. The first 20 minutes were the competency assessment. The physician asked standard orientation questions, then harder ones about Walter's understanding of his estate, the actions he was authorizing, and the consequences for everyone involved. Walter answered each without hesitation and without error. He explained the trust structure in his own words, named the specific risks he was guarding against, and described the difference between a permanent community trust and a standard inheritance in terms that made clear he understood it completely. Then he looked at the camera and spoke directly. He said he wanted to address the question of undue influence before it was raised because he anticipated that it would be. He said Dorian Bell had never asked him for anything, not money, not property, not recognition, and not the administrative role he was now assigning. He said he had raised the subject himself. reasoned through it himself, and retained independent counsel specifically so that no one could later claim the arrangement had been built without scrutiny. He said he was giving the trust to Dorian not because Dorian had cared for him, but because Dorian understood what the clinics were for, and because, in his judgment, after 16 years of watching, Dorian was the only person in his immediate circle who would not compromise that mission under financial pressure. Then, calmly and in sequence, he laid out the evidence he had compiled about Rochelle's actions in the months before his death. The $850,000 withdrawn from the maintenance reserve, the date the account it went to. The transfer of internal patient scheduling data to Tristan Cole's fund, which he had discovered when a staff member flagged the request. He played the audio message he'd sent her, and he presented the read receipt showing she had listened to the whole thing on the evening of a dinner event more than 4 hours before she acknowledged receiving it. "I gave my daughter the chance to come back as my daughter," he said into the camera. "She was advised against it. I don't hold her responsible for every choice she made because I understand the pressures she was under, but I hold her responsible for the choice she made when she listened to that message and decided dinner was more important than her father. That was not Tristan's decision. That was hers." The room was very quiet. Rochelle's attorney made a brief attempt to reframe the video as evidence of Walter's emotional state rather than his legal competence. My attorney noted that every document Walter had referenced, the withdrawal records, the data transfer logs, the audio file, and its read receipts, was independently verifiable and had already been submitted as separate exhibits. The physician's original signed statement attesting to Walter's capacity was in the record. So was the fact that he had later withdrawn it, alongside the timeline, showing that the withdrawal came 17 days after Tristan's fund took a majority position in the debt of the hospital where he held his clinical role. That correlation was not circumstantial. It was documented, dated, and now in front of the court. The judge called a brief recess. When she returned, she confirmed that the competency record was sufficient on its face to sustain Walter's legal actions, that the weight of the video combined with the supporting documentation did not support a finding of undue influence, and that the physician's withdrawal would be referred to the state medical board and to an independent investigator for review of possible witness interference. The challenge to the will was denied. My authority over the Bennett Legacy Trust was confirmed and reinstated. Tristan left the building before the session formally closed. He did not speak to Rochelle on the way out. She found me in the hallway afterward and stood there a moment without saying anything. The composure she'd held through the entire proceeding hadn't broken so much as run out, leaving only what was underneath. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it quietly, without any strategic framing, and I believed she meant it in whatever way she was currently capable of meaning it. "I accept that," I told her. "It doesn't change what needs to happen next." "Could we still make it work," she asked, "if I walked away from the sale?" I spent a long time believing that if I stayed consistent, if I showed up and did the work and held the thing together, that would be enough, I said. I was wrong, not because the effort wasn't real, because you can't hold something together that the other person has already decided to walk away from. The months that followed were administrative more than emotional. The $850,000 Rochelle had withdrawn was restored to the maintenance fund as part of the divorce settlement. The preliminary sale agreement Tristan had been pushing the board toward was formally withdrawn. The investigation into the physician's withdrawn statement went to the appropriate bodies, and its outcome, a professional censure, was entered into a record that could not be undone. I did not get the workshop back. The sale was complete, and the new owner was running it competently. I had built it once. I understood I could build something else when the time was right. Some sacrifices don't net out. You make them because the alternative is worse, and you live with the remainder. The clinic staff submitted a proposal to name one of the examination wings after me. I declined and asked that it be named for Walter and Margaret, instead both of them together using her maiden name beside his, the way they had always worked side by side in service of something larger than either of them alone. The oversight board approved it without debate. I found Walter's letter on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, tucked inside the cover of a worn book on his nightstand. The envelope had my name on it in his handwriting. He wrote that I had not become his son by caring for him. He wrote that I had become his son by keeping a promise even after the person I made it to had stopped keeping hers. He said he hoped I understood the difference, because the first was something anyone could manage under the right circumstances, and the second was a matter of character. I sat in that room a long time after reading it, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the letter said something I had needed to hear and hadn't known I needed until I read it. A year after the hearing, I was locking up after a board meeting at the Southwest Atlanta Clinic when I noticed a figure across the street. It was Rochelle. She was looking at the building at the new sign above the entrance that read, Bennett Holloway Community Care Center, the name Walter had told me about on a quiet evening when he talked about Margaret. She didn't cross the street. She stood there a while looking at the light in the windows and the people visible through the glass staff finishing their shifts. A few late patients, the overnight intake coordinator setting up for the evening. I could see her face well enough to know she wasn't performing anything. There was no audience. She was simply standing there looking at what her father had built and what she had chosen instead. I didn't go to her. I had forgiven her not as a gift to her, but as a release for myself, because carrying that weight forward would have cost more than it was worth. But forgiveness is not the same as restoration, and there was nothing left between us that required me to cross the street. I turned the lock, checked that the entrance was secure, and walked to my car. Marriage is not proven on the day you say the vows. It is proven on the days when there is nothing left to gain from keeping them, and the person you discover yourself to be on those days is the only version of yourself that finally matters. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever shown up for someone who did not show up for you and chosen to keep your integrity anyway, share it with someone who needs to hear that today, and subscribe so you're here when the next story comes.